Welcome, dear friends, to a heartwarming tale of unexpected connections and second chances. Enjoy the story. Frank Pearson's polished leather shoes clicked against the sterile linoleum floor as he followed the nurse down the hallway of Bellevue Hospital. At 65, Frank still cut an impressive figure in his tailored suit, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed back. But today, there was a slight tremor in his usually steady hands, a flicker of fear in his steel-gray eyes. The nurse ushered him into Dr. Patel's office with a sympathetic smile. Frank barely noticed, his mind racing with possibilities. It was probably nothing, he told himself. Just some routine tests. Nothing a man of his means couldn't handle. Dr. Patel looked up from his desk, his face grave. "Mr. Pearson, please, have a seat." Frank lowered himself into the chair, his back ramrod straight. "Well, Doc, what's the verdict?" Dr. Patel took a deep breath. "Mr. Pearson, I'm afraid I have some bad news. The tests, they've come back positive for advanced pancreatic cancer." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. He gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles turning white. "Cancer? But that's impossible. I feel fine." "I'm sorry, Mr. Pearson. The symptoms can be subtle at first, but the scans are quite clear." Frank's mind whirled. This couldn't be happening. Not to him. He was Frank Pearson, CEO of Pearson Enterprises, one of the richest men in New York. He'd built his empire from nothing through sheer determination and grit. Surely he could beat this too. "Okay, so what's the treatment plan?" Frank leaned forward, all business now. "Money's no object, Doc. Whatever it takes. Experimental treatments, specialists from around the world. Just name it." Dr. Patel's eyes softened with sympathy. "Mr. Pearson, I'm afraid it's not that simple. The cancer is already quite advanced. We can try some palliative treatments to make you more comfortable, but—" "But what?" Frank's voice rose, a note of desperation creeping in. "There must be something we can do." "I'm sorry, Mr. Pearson, but at this stage, even with the best treatments available, we're looking at a life expectancy of 3 to 6 months. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Frank slumped back in his chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 65 years. 3 to 6 months, he repeated numbly. That's all?" Dr. Patel nodded solemnly. "I know this is a lot to process. We have excellent counselors here who can help you come to terms with the diagnosis and plan for the time you have left." But Frank was barely listening. His mind was already racing ahead, thinking of all the things he needed to do, all the loose ends he needed to tie up. He'd built his life around his business, and now— "Mr. Pearson?" Dr. Patel's voice cut through his thoughts. "Is there someone I can call for you? Family, perhaps?" Frank gave a bitter laugh. "Family? No, Doc. There's no one. It's just me." As he left the office, Frank felt like he was walking in a daze. The bustling hospital corridor seemed distant, unreal. He'd always known, intellectually, that he would die someday, but he'd always imagined it would be far in the future, after he'd achieved all his goals, built his legacy. Now, faced with his own mortality, Frank realized with a start that he had no idea what that legacy would be. Who would mourn Frank Pearson? Who would miss him when he was gone? For the first time in decades, Frank felt truly, utterly alone. The next morning found Frank in his study, surrounded by stacks of papers and legal documents. He'd been up most of the night, making calls to his lawyers and financial advisors, setting things in motion. His personal assistant, Linda, hovered nervously in the doorway. "Mr. Pearson? Is everything all right? You've never taken a day off before, and now—" Frank looked up, noticing for the first time the worry lines creasing Linda's forehead. How long had she worked for him? 10 years? 15? And he realized he knew next to nothing about her life outside the office. "Linda," he said, his voice gruff with fatigue. "Come in, please. Close the door." As Linda settled into the chair across from him, Frank took a deep breath. "I received some news yesterday. Medical news." He watched as understanding dawned in Linda's eyes, followed quickly by shock and sadness. "Oh, Mr. Pearson," she breathed. "I'm so sorry." Frank waved away her sympathy. "I don't need pity, Linda. What I need is efficiency. There's a lot to be done, and not much time to do it in. He pushed a stack of papers towards her. These are the documents for the sale of the company. I want you to oversee the process. Make sure everything goes smoothly. Linda's eyes widened. Sell the company? But Mr. Pearson, your whole life's work is just that, work, Frank finished for her. And now it's time for someone else to take the reins. The employees will be taken care of. Don't worry. I've made sure of that. As Linda leafed through the documents, Frank turned to gaze out the window. The New York skyline stretched out before him, a testament to human ambition and drive. How many of those buildings had he had a hand in, either through financing or outright ownership? And yet, looking at them now, he felt nothing. No pride, no sense of accomplishment. Just a vast, echoing emptiness. Linda, he said suddenly, turning back to her, what would you do if you knew you only had a few months left to live? Linda looked up, startled by the question. I don't know, Mr. Pearson. I suppose I'd want to spend time with my family, make sure they were taken care of. Family. There was that word again. Frank nodded, more to himself than to Linda. Yes, I suppose that's what most people would do. Thank you, Linda. That will be all for now. As Linda left the room, Frank turned back to his desk. There was still so much to do. He needed to update his will, research retirement homes, make arrangements for his eventual departure. But as he worked, a small voice in the back of his mind kept whispering. Was this really how he wanted to spend his final months? Buried in paperwork, making cold, businesslike arrangements for the end of his life? There had to be more. There had to be a way to make these last months count for something. Frank just didn't know what that something was. Not yet. A week after his diagnosis, Frank found himself wandering through Central Park. He'd finished most of the necessary arrangements, and now found himself at loose ends, unsure of how to fill his suddenly empty days. The park was bustling with life, joggers pounding the paths, children shrieking with laughter on the playgrounds, couples strolling hand in hand. Frank felt like a ghost among them, separate and apart from their vibrant energy. As he walked, he became aware of a growing discomfort in his abdomen. Dr. Patel had warned him about this, the first physical signs of his condition making themselves known. Frank gritted his teeth, determined to ignore it, but soon found himself looking for a place to rest. He spotted an empty bench and made his way towards it, lowering himself down with a barely suppressed groan. As he sat there, trying to catch his breath, he became aware of a presence beside him. Looking up, he saw a woman and a young girl standing nearby, watching him with a mixture of concern and wariness. The woman was thin to the point of gauntness, her clothes shabby and worn. The little girl, who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, clung to her hand, wide-eyed. "Are you okay, mister?" the little girl asked, her voice small but clear. Frank managed a wan smile. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just needed to catch my breath." The woman tugged gently on the girl's hand. "Come on, Annie. We shouldn't bother the nice man." Something in the woman's voice, a note of quiet desperation perhaps, made Frank look closer. He noticed the worn-out shoes, the way the woman's eyes darted around as if always on alert. With a start, he realized they were probably homeless. Before he could think better of it, Frank heard himself saying, "Wait, please." The woman paused, looking at him warily. Frank fumbled in his pocket, pulling out his wallet. I'd like to help if I can. Maybe buy you and your daughter a meal." The woman's face hardened. "We don't need charity, sir." Frank backpedaled quickly. No, of course not. It's just, I have this big house, and I was about to make dinner and, well, it would be nice to have some company, that's all." He saw the conflict play out on the woman's face, pride warring with practical need. Finally, she nodded slowly. "That's very kind of you. I'm Natalie, and this is my daughter, Annie." "Frank Pearson," he introduced himself, standing up with only a slight wince. "My car's just over there. Shall we?" As they walked to his car, Frank couldn't help but wonder what he was doing. Inviting strangers into his home, it was so unlike him, and yet for the first time since his diagnosis, he felt a spark of something. Interest? Purpose? He wasn't sure, but he was curious to see where it might lead. Frank's spacious kitchen gleamed with unused appliances and spotless countertops. As he moved around, pulling out pots and pans, he was acutely aware of Natalie and Annie's wide-eyed stares. "I don't cook much," he admitted, a bit sheepishly. "Usually I have a housekeeper who takes care of meals, but she's off today." Natalie nodded, still looking a bit overwhelmed. Can I help with anything?" Frank was about to refuse, but then he saw the genuine offer in her eyes. "Sure," he said. "How about you chop these vegetables while I start on the pasta?" As they worked side by side, an awkward silence fell. Frank, unused to making small talk, scrambled for something to say. "So, have you lived in New York long?" Natalie's hand stilled for a moment. "Born and raised," she said quietly, "though it hasn't always been like this." Frank nodded, not wanting to pry, but to his surprise, Natalie continued. "I had a normal life once," she said, her voice distant. "A job, an apartment, but then, well, life has a way of throwing curveballs, doesn't it?" Frank thought of his recent diagnosis and nodded. "That it does." As they sat down to eat, Natalie shared more of her story. A troubled childhood, bouncing between foster homes, a failed relationship that left her pregnant and alone, the struggle to make ends meet, the spiral into homelessness. "Annie's all I have," she finished, pulling the little girl close. "I'm trying to do right by her, but—" Frank listened, really listened, in a way he couldn't remember doing in years. He saw the love between mother and daughter, the quiet dignity with which Natalie faced her struggles, and he felt something shift inside him. As the evening wound down, Frank found himself reluctant to see them go. "You're welcome to stay the night," he offered. "I have plenty of guest rooms." Natalie hesitated, but one look at Annie's hopeful face decided her. "Thank you," she said softly. "That's very kind." As Frank showed them to their rooms, he felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with his illness. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he'd done something that mattered. Something that made a difference, if only for one night. He went to bed that night with a lot to think about. Frank lay awake in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet, but his mind was anything but. He couldn't stop thinking about Natalie and Annie, about the stark contrast between their lives and his, about the look in Annie's eyes when she'd seen his fully stocked fridge, as if she couldn't quite believe so much food could exist in one place. And he thought about his own situation, the ticking clock of his mortality, the vast emptiness of his remaining days stretching out before him. What was he going to do with the time he had left? Retreat to a sterile retirement home, waiting for the inevitable? The thought filled him with a deep, aching loneliness. But maybe there was another way. The idea came to him slowly, piece by piece. It was crazy, impulsive, completely out of character for the careful, calculating businessman he'd always been. But the more he thought about it, the more right it felt. By the time dawn broke, Frank had made his decision. He just hoped he wasn't making a terrible mistake. Frank found Natalie and Annie in the kitchen the next morning, Natalie attempting to tidy up while Annie munched on a bowl of cereal. "Good morning," Frank said, trying to keep his voice casual. "I hope you slept well?" Natalie nodded, looking a bit flustered. "Yes, thank you. We were just about to head out. We've imposed on your kindness long enough." "Actually," Frank said, taking a deep breath, "I was hoping we could talk for a moment. There's something I'd like to propose." Natalie's brow furrowed, but she nodded cautiously. "Okay." Frank gestured towards the living room. Once they were seated, Annie playing quietly with a stuffed animal she'd found, Frank began. "I haven't been entirely honest with you," he started. "The truth is, I received some difficult news recently. Medical news." He saw understanding dawn in Natalie's eyes, followed quickly by sympathy. But he pressed on before she could speak. "I don't have much time left," he said bluntly, "and I've been struggling with how to spend that time. But meeting you and Annie, it's made me realize something." Frank leaned forward, his eyes intense. "This house, it's too big for just me, and soon I won't need it at all. I've been looking into retirement homes, but the thought of spending my last days there—" He shook his head. What I'm trying to say is, I'd like you and Annie to have this house. Natalie's jaw dropped. What? Mr. Pearson, that's too much. We can't possibly. Frank held up a hand. Please hear me out. I have more money than I could ever spend. No family to leave it to. But you and Annie, you could make this a home. Give it life again. He saw the conflict in Natalie's eyes. Disbelief, hope, and a flicker of suspicion. Why? She asked softly. Why would you do this for strangers? Frank smiled sadly. Because in the short time I've known you, you've shown me more about what really matters in life than I've learned in 65 years. And because it feels right. Natalie was shaking her head, tears gathering in her eyes. I don't know what to say. It's overwhelming. You don't have to decide right now, Frank assured her. Take some time to think about it, but know that the offer is genuine, no strings attached. Annie, who had been listening quietly, suddenly spoke up. Does this mean we get to stay, Mommy? In the big house with the comfy beds? Natalie pulled her daughter close, her voice choked with emotion. I don't know, sweetie. We'll see. As Frank watched them, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time since his diagnosis, he felt like he was doing something worthwhile with the time he had left. A week later, Frank found himself standing in the lobby of Sunset Meadows, the retirement home he'd chosen for his final days. The smell of disinfectant hung in the air, mingling with the scent of cafeteria food. The director, a kindly-looking woman in her 50s, greeted him warmly. Mr. Pearson, welcome to Sunset Meadows. We're so pleased to have you join us. Frank nodded, trying to muster a smile. He'd left Natalie and Annie settling into the house, still seeming shell-shocked by their change in fortune. He hoped he was doing the right thing. As the director led him on a tour, chattering about activities and amenities, Frank's mind wandered. He thought about the life he was leaving behind, the legacy he'd tried to build. It all seemed so hollow now. Mr. Pearson? The director's voice cut through his thoughts. Is everything all right? Frank realized he'd stopped walking, lost in his musings. Yes, sorry, just taking it all in. The director smiled sympathetically. It can be overwhelming at first, but I assure you, many of our residents find a new lease on life here. As they reached Frank's assigned room, the director paused, a slight frown creasing her brow. Mr. Pearson, if you don't mind my asking, I've reviewed your medical files, and I'm a bit puzzled. With your diagnosis, there are treatments that could potentially extend your life. Yet you've chosen not to pursue them. May I ask why? Frank was quiet for a moment, considering. Finally, he said, When I first got the diagnosis, I was ready to give up. But now I'm not so sure. I think I may have found something worth fighting for. The director's eyes softened. Well, Mr. Pearson, it's never too late to change your mind. If you decide you want to explore treatment options, we have excellent medical staff who can assist you. Frank nodded, a small spark of hope kindling in his chest. Thank you. I'll keep that in mind. As he settled into his new room, Frank found himself thinking not of the end of his life, but of new beginnings. For Natalie and Annie, yes, but maybe, just maybe, for himself as well. Frank had been at Sunset Meadows for just over a month when he received the frantic call from Annie. He'd given them his number just in case, never really expecting them to use it. Mr. Frank. Annie's voice was high and panicked. Mommy's sick, really sick. She won't wake up and I don't know what to do. Frank's heart raced. Annie, listen to me carefully. I want you to hang up and call 911 right away. Tell them your address and that your mother is unconscious. Can you do that for me? Yes, Annie hiccuped. Good girl. After you've done that, I want you to go to the front door and wait for the ambulance. I'm on my way. Frank hung up and immediately dialed for a taxi. As he waited, pacing anxiously in the lobby, he cursed himself for not checking in more often. He should have known better than to leave a formerly homeless woman and a young child alone without support. The ride to his old house seemed to take an eternity. When he finally arrived, he found the street blocked by an ambulance, its lights flashing silently in the afternoon sun. Annie was sitting on the front steps, her small frame shaking with sobs. When she saw Frank, she launched herself into his arms. They took Mommy away, she cried. They said she has to go to the hospital. Frank held her close, his heart breaking for the scared little girl. It's okay, sweetheart. Your mom is going to get the best care possible. I promise. As they rode to the hospital in Frank's hastily summoned car, he couldn't help but marvel at how quickly this child had come to mean so much to him. He'd known her for barely a month, and yet the thought of anything happening to her or Natalie filled him with a dread he hadn't felt in years. At the hospital, they were directed to the emergency waiting room. Frank settled Annie into a chair, with a promise to find out what was happening. As he approached the nurse's station, he drew himself up to his full height, channeling every ounce of his former CEO authority. I need information on Natalie Carter. She was brought in by ambulance a short while ago. The nurse eyed him skeptically. Are you family? Frank hesitated for just a moment before saying firmly, Yes, I am. As he waited for news, holding Annie's hand and trying to distract her with stories from his childhood, Frank made a silent vow. Whatever happened, he would be there for this little family. They needed him, and if he was honest with himself, he needed them too. Hours passed before they were finally allowed to see Natalie. Frank had to do some fast talking to convince the staff to let Annie in, but he refused to leave the child alone in the waiting room. Natalie looked small and pale against the stark white hospital sheets. Her eyes fluttered open as they entered, a weak smile forming on her lips when she saw Annie. Hey, baby, she whispered. I'm sorry I scared you. Annie rushed to the bedside, careful not to disturb the IV lines. Mommy, are you okay? Natalie stroked her daughter's hair. I'm going to be fine, sweetie. The doctors are taking good care of me. Frank hung back, not wanting to intrude on the moment, but Natalie's eyes found his over Annie's head. Frank, she said softly, thank you for coming, for taking care of Annie. He stepped closer, shaking his head. No need to thank me. How are you feeling? Natalie's smile faltered. Tired and scared, if I'm honest. Frank could see the fear in her eyes, not just for herself, but for Annie. He understood all too well the terror of an uncertain future. Listen, he said, keeping his voice low so Annie wouldn't overhear. Whatever happens, whatever you need, tests, treatments, specialists, it's covered. Don't worry about the cost. Just focus on getting better. Tears welled up in Natalie's eyes. Frank, I can't possibly. You can, he interrupted gently, and you will, for Annie's sake, if nothing else. Natalie nodded, too overwhelmed to argue further. As a nurse came in to check Natalie's vitals, Frank took Annie out to find some dinner in the cafeteria. Over rubbery hospital pizza, Annie looked up at Frank with serious eyes. Is Mommy going to be okay? Frank's heart clenched. He wanted to promise her that everything would be fine, but he'd learned the hard way that such promises could be cruel in their false hope. Instead, he said, Your mom is very strong, and the doctors here are very good at their jobs. We're going to do everything we can to help her get better. Annie nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. As they made their way back to Natalie's room, Frank found himself marveling at the resilience of children, and for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the next few months. A future where he was part of this little family's life, watching Annie grow up, helping Natalie build the life she deserved. It was a future worth fighting for. As Natalie recovered in the hospital, Frank found himself spending more and more time with Annie. At first, it was out of necessity. Someone had to look after the child while her mother was ill. But soon, Frank realized he was genuinely enjoying their time together. They fell into a routine. Frank would pick Annie up from school. He'd insisted on enrolling her in a good private school near the house, and they'd spend the afternoons together before visiting Natalie in the hospital. One day, as they walked through a toy store, Frank had quickly learned that spoiling Annie a little helped ease her worry about her mother. Annie tugged on his hand. Mr. Frank, she said hesitantly, can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. What is it? Annie bit her lip, looking uncharacteristically serious. Are you sick too, like Mommy? Frank felt his heart skip a beat. He'd been so focused on Natalie and Annie that he'd almost forgotten about his own diagnosis. He knelt down to Annie's level, choosing his words carefully. I was sick, he said slowly. The doctors told me I had a very serious illness, but you know what? Since I met you and your mom, I've been feeling a lot better. Annie's face lit up. Really? Did we make you better? Frank chuckled, ruffling her hair. In a way, I think you did. You and your mom reminded me of what's really important in life, and that made me want to fight harder. Annie threw her arms around Frank's neck, hugging him tightly. I'm glad you're feeling better, Mr. Frank. I like having you around. Frank felt a lump form in his throat as he hugged her back. I like being around too, kiddo. As they continued their shopping, Frank found himself thinking about the future again. He'd been putting off going back to his doctors, half afraid of what they might tell him. But now, looking at Annie's bright smile as she examined a stuffed unicorn, he knew he couldn't put it off any longer. He owed it to Annie and Natalie, and to himself, to fight. To see where this unexpected second chance at life might lead. The following week, Frank found himself back in Dr. Patel's office. The doctor looked surprised to see him. Mr. Pearson, he said, gesturing for Frank to take a seat. I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. Is everything all right? Frank took a deep breath. Actually, Doc, I was hoping we could run those tests again. All of them. Dr. Patel's eyebrows rose. May I ask what prompted this? When we last spoke, you seemed resigned to the diagnosis. Frank smiled, thinking of Annie's gap-toothed grin and Natalie's quiet strength. Let's just say I've found a reason to fight. Several reasons, actually. As Dr. Patel arranged for the tests, Frank felt a mix of hope and fear. What if the re-examination only confirmed the original diagnosis? Could he bear to have his newfound hope crushed? But as he thought of Annie and Natalie waiting for him, he knew he had to try. Whatever the outcome, he owed it to them, and to himself, to face it head-on. The next few days were a blur of tests and scans. Frank was poked, prodded, and examined more thoroughly than he'd ever been in his life. Through it all, he held on to the image of Annie's smile, of Natalie's quiet determination as she fought her own health battles. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Frank found himself back in Dr. Patel's office, waiting for the results. The doctor entered, a puzzled expression on his face. He sat down heavily, looking at Frank over the top of his glasses. Mr. Pearson, he began slowly, I'm not quite sure how to say this. Frank's heart raced. Was this it? The confirmation of his death sentence? But then Dr. Patel broke into a wide smile. It seems we owe you an apology, Mr. Pearson. There's been a rather significant mix-up. Frank leaned forward, hardly daring to hope. What are you saying, Doc? I'm saying, Mr. Pearson, that you are not in fact terminally ill. The original scans were mislabeled. They belong to another patient with a similar name. Your new tests show some issues with high blood pressure, which we'll need to monitor, but nothing life-threatening. Frank sat back, stunned. He felt like he'd been hit by a truck, but in the best possible way. So, I'm not dying? He asked, needing to hear it again. Dr. Patel shook his head, still smiling. No, Mr. Pearson. You are very much alive, and with proper care, you should have many years ahead of you. As the doctor continued to explain about follow-up appointments and medication for his blood pressure, Frank found his mind racing ahead. He wasn't dying. He had time. Time to live. Time to make a difference. Time to be there for Annie and Natalie. He left the hospital in a daze, his feet barely touching the ground. He had been given a second chance at life in more ways than one, and he was determined not to waste it. Frank practically floated into Natalie's hospital room, a huge grin on his face and a cake box in his hands. Annie, who had been coloring at her mother's bedside, looked up in surprise. Mr. Frank, she exclaimed, why are you so happy? And is that cake? Natalie, who had been looking much better in recent days, raised an eyebrow. Frank, what's going on? Frank set the cake down and pulled up a chair, his eyes shining with excitement. I have some news, he said, trying to keep his voice calm. Some very good news, actually. He took a deep breath, looking from Natalie to Annie and back again. It turns out I'm not sick after all. There was a mix-up with my tests. I'm going to be okay. There was a moment of stunned silence, and then Annie let out a whoop of joy. throwing herself into Frank's arms. "You're not sick! You're not going to die!" Frank hugged her tightly, feeling tears prick at his eyes. "That's right, kiddo, I'm not going anywhere." He looked over at Natalie, who was watching them with a mix of joy and something else. Was it uncertainty? "Natalie," he said softly, reaching out to take her hand. "I know this changes things. I made you an offer based on circumstances that no longer apply. But I want you to know, my offer still stands. If you and Annie want it, the house is yours, no strings attached." Natalie's eyes welled up with tears. "Oh, Frank," she whispered, "how can we ever thank you?" Frank shook his head, smiling. "You already have. You and Annie, you gave me a reason to live when I thought I was dying. You showed me what really matters in life. If anything, I should be thanking you." Annie, who had been listening intently, piped up. "Does this mean we get to keep living in the big house? And that you'll come visit us lots and lots?" Frank chuckled, ruffling her hair. "If that's what you want, sweetheart, then yes, I'd love to be a part of your lives if you'll have me." Natalie squeezed his hand, her eyes shining. "We'd like that very much, Frank. Very much indeed." As they cut into the cake, celebrating not just Frank's health but the new family they had formed, Frank felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with his recent medical tests. He looked at Annie, her face smeared with frosting, and Natalie, her eyes bright with happiness and unshed tears, and knew that his life had changed in ways he never could have imagined. "You know," he said as he handed Natalie a slice of cake, "I think this calls for more than just cake. How about we plan a proper celebration once you're out of here, Natalie? Maybe a trip to the zoo for Annie, or that new children's museum downtown." Annie's eyes lit up. "Can we really? I've never been to a zoo before." Natalie laughed, a sound that Frank realized he'd been hearing more and more lately. "I think that sounds wonderful, Frank. But are you sure you're up for it? You've already done so much for us." Frank waved away her concerns. "Nonsense! I've got a new lease on life and I intend to make the most of it. Besides," he added with a wink at Annie, "I hear the zoo has penguins. Who wouldn't want to see penguins?" As they continued to chat and plan, Frank felt a sense of peace settle over him. He'd spent so much of his life chasing success, always looking to the next big deal, the next acquisition. But now, sitting in a hospital room with a woman he'd met by chance, and a little girl who'd stolen his heart, he realized he'd finally found what he'd been looking for all along: family, connection, purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, he knew. Natalie still had her own health challenges to overcome, and integrating himself into their lives would take time and patience. But for the first time in years, Frank was looking forward to the future with genuine excitement. As the afternoon wore on, and Annie began to doze off in her chair, Frank stood up to leave. "I should let you get some rest," he said to Natalie, "but I'll be back tomorrow. Is there anything you need?" Natalie shook her head, her eyes soft with gratitude. "Just you, Frank. You've given us more than we ever could have dreamed of." Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion. "And you've given me a second chance at life," he replied. "I'd say we're even." As he left the hospital, stepping out into the warm afternoon sun, Frank took a deep breath. The city bustled around him, full of life and possibility. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Frank felt truly, deeply happy. He had been given a miraculous second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. With Natalie and Annie by his side, he knew that the best was yet to come. 1 year later. The Holloway house was alive with laughter and music as friends and family gathered to celebrate Annie's 8th birthday. In the backyard, children ran and played, their shrieks of joy carried on the warm summer breeze. Frank stood on the porch, watching the scene with a contented smile. Natalie came up beside him, slipping her arm through his. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. Frank chuckled. "Just thinking about how much can change in a year. If you'd told me last summer that I'd be hosting a kid's birthday party, I'd have said you were crazy." Natalie smiled up at him. "Good crazy or bad crazy?" "The best kind," Frank replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. From inside the house, they heard the timer go off. "That'll be the cake," Natalie said. We should probably round up the troops." As they began to gather the children, Frank caught sight of Annie, her face flushed with excitement as she showed off her new bicycle to her friends. She looked up, catching his eye, and waved enthusiastically. "Uncle Frank," she called out, "is it cake time?" Frank's heart swelled at the title. He and Natalie had decided early on that Uncle Frank felt more natural than trying to force a paternal role, but it didn't make his love for Annie any less deep. "Sure is, kiddo," he called back. "Come on, everyone, time to sing." As they all gathered around the table, Frank looked at the faces surrounding him. There was Natalie, radiant in her recovery, standing beside him. Annie, bouncing with excitement as she eyed the candles on her cake. His old friend Mike, who'd been surprised but supportive of Frank's life changes. Even Linda, his former assistant, who'd become a good friend to Natalie. This, Frank realized, was what true wealth looked like. Not the numbers in his bank account or the properties he owned, but the love and connection he shared with these people who had become his family. As they sang Happy Birthday to Annie, Frank felt a lump form in his throat. He thought back to that day in the doctor's office, when he'd thought his life was over. Instead, it had been just the beginning. After the cake was cut and distributed, Frank raised his glass in a toast. "To second chances," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And to family, the ones we're born with, and the ones we choose." As glasses clinked and smiles were exchanged, Frank knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The storm that had brought Natalie and Annie into his life had done more than just give him a new family. It had brought healing, purpose, and a love deeper than he'd ever known. And as he watched Annie blow out her candles, her face scrunched up in concentration as she made her wish, Frank made a wish of his own. Not for more time or more money, but for this, for family, for love, for the joy of ordinary moments made extraordinary by the people you share them with. As the party continued around them, Frank pulled Natalie close, whispering in her ear, "Thank you for giving me a reason to live." Natalie turned in his arms, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Thank you for giving us a home and so much more." And as they shared a kiss, sweet with the promise of all the years to come, Frank knew that he had found his true legacy. Not in the buildings that bore his name or the deals he'd closed, but in the love he'd found, the lives he'd touched, and the family he'd built. It was, he thought, the best investment he'd ever made.